My name is Helena, and I bought my condo in Savannah with my own work and savings. I am an audit accountant, the kind of person who tracks every cent and keeps every document in order. That condo was my peace, my quiet place after long seasons of deadlines, travel schedules, client meetings, and sleepless nights during audit reviews. I had just returned from a 2-week work trip. The taxi dropped me off in front of the brick building I loved. I remember thinking how good it would feel to shower, unpack slowly, and rest in my own bed again. That thought disappeared the moment I opened the door. Ring lights glared at me, glitter and makeup brushes were spread across my kitchen island. There were softbox lights in the hallway and stacks of product boxes piled up near the sofa. I barely recognized my living room. It looked like a beauty studio set for recording tutorials and promotional videos. Standing in the center of it was my younger sister Hailey, surrounded by opened PR packages while she filmed something into her phone. Next to her was Hailey's friend Sophie, adjusting light angles and telling her which poses looked best. Neither of them noticed me at first. They were laughing about branding and engagement numbers. I just stood there, suitcase still in hand, as the place I worked years to afford was being used like a set they owned. There was no warning, no request, no permission asked. I felt something sharp settle in my chest. It was not shock. It was recognition. I knew something had been crossed. I know everyone reacts differently. Some people stay quiet, others confront things immediately. If you were in my place in that exact moment, what would you do? Share your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to hear your perspective. I didn't confront anyone right away. There was a tightness in my chest, but my voice stayed quiet because I needed to understand how far this had already gone. Hailey barely paused her filming. When she finally acknowledged me, she just smiled and said something about how lucky I was to have such great lighting in this place. I placed my suitcase by the door, trying to keep my breathing steady. Later that evening, my parents arrived. My mother Linda walked in first. She carried a reusable grocery bag filled with snacks and bottled iced coffee, the kind Hailey liked. My father Gerald followed her, taking slow steps while looking around my condo with a sense of familiarity that unsettled me. Mom set the bag on the counter and commented on how the space felt so lively now. Dad nodded and said it looked much more welcoming than before. They sat down while Hailey continued organizing cosmetics. The lights kept shining, the camera was still recording, and my living room felt like a stage in a house I no longer owned. I sat across from them, my keys still in my hand, as if holding them would remind me that I was not a guest. Mom was the first to speak. She said Hailey had been working very hard to grow her online business and that she needed a quiet, aesthetically pleasing space to film. The apartment she shared with Sophie was small, noisy, and did not match the brand image she wanted to build. Mom said it as if it were obvious that my place should be the solution. Dad leaned back, resting his arm across the top of the sofa that used to be mine alone. He said this arrangement made sense because I was barely home lately. He mentioned my work trips and long hours like they were reasons I did not deserve to have space to myself. Hailey did not look up from the products she was arranging. She said I should be supportive and learn to share. She said success meant helping family rise together. The way she spoke made it sound like the condo had always belonged to all of us, as if my years of saving, signing mortgage papers, and paying every bill had been a family project. I asked how long she had been staying there. Hailey responded casually, telling me it had been about a month. Mom nodded as if this was completely reasonable. Dad added that they had checked the place regularly to make sure everything was respected. The word respected did not match what I saw around me. I looked at Mom. I asked why no one told me. She said they did not want to stress me while I was working. She said they assumed I would understand. There was no apology anywhere in her tone. I could feel heat rising in my throat, but I kept my hands still on my lap. I realized that if I reacted emotionally in that moment, they would frame it as me being dramatic or selfish. They were already settled into the belief that this arrangement was fair. Hailey finally looked at me, almost amused, and said, "Relax. We're family. The phrase sounded like a lock clicking shut. I stood up, slowly walked into my bedroom, and saw more ring lights, more makeup organizers, and clothes hung over the chair where I used to read after work. I sat on the edge of the bed and breathed steady and silent because I understood I needed clarity before action. I did not confront anyone that night. I simply watched. I observed how sure they were that they were entitled to my space. I needed to see the shape of their confidence before I dismantled it. 3 days later, I started checking my mail. I had returned to my usual routine of waking early, making coffee in the quiet kitchen before anyone else came in to film, and preparing for another workday. The mailbox in the lobby had always been something I checked without much thought, a simple part of daily life. This time I opened it slowly because I already suspected that the house I had come back to was not entirely mine anymore. There were envelopes addressed to me, bills and bank statements, nothing surprising. Then I saw a padded envelope with a return label from a skincare brand I recognized from Hailey's content. My name was handwritten on the label. I opened it in the elevator and found a contract packet along with sample products wrapped in tissue paper. The contract was not addressed to me but to Hailey, listing her as a promotional partner. The mailing address was my condo's address. I reviewed the document carefully. It included a W-9 form that had already been filled out. I scanned the numbers the way I have done for years in audit review sessions, my eyes moving automatically through each line. The social security number on the form was not Hailey's. It was mine. The recognition struck in a still, cold way. I knew the number by heart, something a person never forgets, something no one should ever use except the individual it belongs to. I stood in the elevator holding the papers, the doors sliding open while I did not move. The building's hallway was quiet, but the silence felt unfamiliar. I walked back into the condo and set the envelope on the dining table. Hailey was filming again, adjusting her voice to sound cheerful. Sophie was holding the camera for her. Neither of them looked toward me. The lights were bright enough to erase shadows. I walked to my bedroom and opened my laptop. I pulled up my credit monitoring account and searched for recent inquiries. There were 2 new entries linked to online payment platforms, ones Hailey used for sponsorship money transfers. My name appeared beside them. I checked each line twice. I did not speak. I simply observed the way I do during audits when something begins to reveal itself. Later that afternoon, while Hailey and Sophie took a break, I heard Sophie laughing at something on her phone. I glanced over. She was showing Hailey a story she had posted. It showed my living room in full view, the caption saying, "New creative space at Hailey's condo." The comments were full of people complimenting the interior and asking how she afforded such a place. Hailey replied with a short message about working hard and building slowly. The comments praised her. The condo was mine. There was no mention of me. Not even once. I walked to my closet where I kept old tax files, property purchase documents, and mortgage statements. I gathered them neatly into a folder, placed them in my work tote, and zipped it closed. I took photos of the W-9 form, the envelope, the comments under the post, and the story Sophie had shared. I created a digital folder on my laptop labeled simply with the date. The act of organizing the information steadied me. My breathing slowed. The heat in my chest settled into something sharper and more controlled. I did not speak to Hailey, Mom, Dad, or Sophie about what I found. I did not accuse or question. I needed to see how confidently they would continue. I needed to see how far they believed this reality stretched. I remained quiet because silence at the right time reveals the truth more clearly than confrontation. I watched. I documented. I waited. That afternoon, I asked everyone to sit down. The ring lights were still set up, and the makeup products were arranged across the kitchen island, but I needed them all in one place looking directly at me. Hailey lowered her phone reluctantly and took a seat on the couch. Mom sat beside her with a soft sigh, and Dad chose the armchair near the window, folding his hands on his lap. Sophie stayed standing, leaning quietly against the counter, watching. I placed the folder of documents on the coffee table. I did not raise my voice or explain myself in a long speech. I simply opened the folder and laid out the contract, the W-9 form, and the screenshots I had printed of the story showing the caption calling my condo hers. The room stayed quiet for several moments, the kind of stillness where people wait to see who speaks first. Mom was the first. She looked at the papers, blinked once, and then looked directly at me with a tired expression that I recognized from childhood conversations, where she wanted to steer the tone before anyone else could. She said I was reading too much into it, that families share things, and that I always had a way of making situations more dramatic than they needed to be. She said the Social Security number was probably entered by mistake, and that I should not make accusations that could harm relationships. Dad avoided my eyes altogether. He studied a spot on the wall while I spoke, only occasionally nodding when Mom talked. It was the same quiet distance he used whenever conflict appeared in the house when I was younger, the kind that told me I would always stand alone in any disagreement. Hailey leaned forward and picked up the contract casually, as if reviewing a menu. She said the company needed the form filled quickly, and since I rarely used my condo and was always traveling, she assumed it was fine to handle things this way. She said I was fortunate to have something she could use. She said we should help each other, and she was helping the family too by growing her platform. Her tone carried a certainty that startled me. It was not carelessness, it was ownership. Sophie stayed silent, but her expression was confident, almost approving of Hailey's explanation. I asked Hailey directly why she believed she could use my identity information. Hailey smiled, not with guilt, but with the pride of someone who believed she was justified. She said we were family, and family did not need to ask for permission for things that benefited everyone. She said I had always kept distance from them, always focused on work, always acting like I was separate from the rest of the family. Mom interrupted again, saying Hailey was right, that I had always been so cold, independent, self-contained, and difficult to approach. She said I used work as a shield, and that it was no wonder they assumed I would not mind. She framed my boundaries as flaws. Dad still did not speak. I listened without reacting. Their words moved around the room like familiar shadows. None of this was new. The difference was that now I could see the pattern with clarity instead of confusion. I gathered the documents back into the folder slowly. I did not defend myself. I did not argue or raise my voice. I simply said that I understood how each of them saw me now, and that understanding was going to shape what happened next. Hailey rolled her eyes. Mom shook her head. Dad remained silent. I stood up, took my folder, and walked to my room. I closed the door quietly and stood for a moment in the stillness of my room. The emotions moving through me were not loud or violent. There was no sudden surge of anger or dramatic heartbreak. Instead, something settled with absolute clarity, like a line being drawn in firm ink that would not fade. I understood exactly what I needed to do, and I understood that there was no returning to how things had been before. There would be no explanations, no debates, and no attempts to change their minds. The consequences would speak clearly enough. They would understand everything in time. A week passed, and the condo became even louder. The quiet space I once returned to after long workdays had turned into a stage where every corner was used for content. Hailey and Sophie had developed a schedule that revolved around filming periods and product shipment arrivals, packages stacked near the entrance. More lighting equipment appeared in the living room. The kitchen island was filled with skincare bottles and lip gloss containers arranged in neat rows to display during live streams. One afternoon, Hailey announced she would be doing a joint live stream with Sophie for a new promotional launch. They spent nearly an hour adjusting lighting angles and camera placement. I stayed in my room with my laptop open, reviewing work files. Even with the door closed, I could hear their voices rising in excitement, rehearsing phrases that sounded polished and confident. They practiced answering imaginary questions from potential viewers. Their energy filled the entire apartment. When the live stream started, the volume increased. Hailey spoke brightly about her home studio, describing how she had designed the space to reflect her personal style. Sophie added comments to highlight how perfect the lighting and layout were. They moved the camera around to show different angles of the condo. I stood in the hallway quietly just outside the frame, listening. Hailey presented the condo as if it were hers entirely, as if she had earned it, paid for it, and built her brand from it. Every sentence carefully implied ownership without stating it directly. During the stream, a neighbor knocked at the door. The sound was sharp and irritated. Sophie muted the microphone while Hailey went to answer. The neighbor spoke quietly but firmly. He said the noise had become disruptive and that several residents had complained. Hailey smiled politely, apologized, and closed the door. As soon as the stream resumed, she joked about living in a lively building and continued without a hint of concern. Later that evening, I received an email from the building management office. The message stated that complaints had been filed about excessive noise and unauthorized commercial use of the unit. There was a reminder in formal language that the lease agreement did not allow business activity that could disturb other residents. I read the email twice, then archived it carefully in the same digital folder that held the contract W-9 form and screenshots. Hailey saw me at the kitchen counter and asked casually if I could bring in some packages the next day because she had collaboration scheduled and did not want deliveries to go missing. The request was spoken the way one might speak to an assistant. There was no hesitation in her tone, no awareness of the imbalance that now defined our home. Sophie continued cleaning makeup brushes and did not look in my direction. I looked at Hailey and nodded once. I did not argue. I did not react. I recorded the interaction internally the way I had started to do with every moment. There was no benefit to confrontation. I needed clarity, and clarity required patience. That night, I sat in the living room after they went to bed. The ring lights were unplugged but still stood where they had been placed. The camera rested on a tripod. The condo was dim again, but it no longer felt quiet. It felt occupied in a way that erased the person who had once lived there. I walked through the rooms slowly. I took pictures of the setup of the packages, of the equipment, of the layout for the live stream. I documented everything with a calm focus that came from my work. Patterns, evidence, consistency. All of it had taken shape without resistance from me, and that was precisely what allowed it to reveal itself fully. I sat on the edge of my bed and reviewed each file before storing them in chronological order. I knew the silence would not last forever, but for now, silence was working for me. 2 more weeks went by. During that time, the condo shifted from something merely inconvenient to something that demanded attention. I noticed the change through small things, first small enough to ignore if I had wanted to pretend the situation was temporary. Packages addressed to unfamiliar names arrived at my mailbox, each one clearly tied to a sponsorship, each one related to skincare or beauty brands. The return labels listed marketing agencies and distribution warehouses, which meant contracts were involved somewhere. I began placing them on the counter without opening them, documenting each delivery with time-stamped photos. I wanted a clean record, something that reflected what was happening without commentary or accusation. Around the middle of the second week, one package included a folder taped to the outside. The folder contained brand guidelines and influencer expectations which would not have concerned me if not for the final page. My full name, my condo address, and the last 4 digits of my social security number were printed at the bottom of a contract signature sheet. That detail did not happen by accident. It meant someone had submitted my personal information. I took another set of photos and saved a copy of the document to an encrypted drive. I did not call Hailey. I did not call Mom or Dad. I simply prepared. That same afternoon, I received an email from one of the companies listed on the documents. They requested verification of homeownership for the filming location, stating that their legal department needed confirmation for liability coverage. The request was polite, almost routine, but the implications behind it were not. They would only ask if someone had claimed the condo was theirs. I considered whether replying immediately would escalate things, but the situation had already escalated. I forwarded the email to my work laptop and spent the evening collecting proof. I pulled the closing documents, the property tax receipts, the deed, the insurance paperwork, and even screenshots of payment history from my mortgage app. There was no question of ownership. The condo was mine, purchased with years of long hours and meticulous savings. The next day, during lunch at the office, I asked my coworker Anthony if he had a moment. Anthony worked in compliance and had a calm, measured way of examining situations without overreacting. We sat in a quiet corner of the break room while I showed him the documents and explained what had been happening. Anthony did not interrupt. He read each page with patient detail. Once he finished, he looked up and told me that what occurred was identity misuse and potentially contract fraud. His tone was neutral, not dramatic, not sympathetic, but clear. That clarity helped me breathe. With his guidance, I drafted a professional response to the sponsorship coordinator. The email included attached proof of ownership and a concise explanation that no permission had been granted for commercial activity at my residence. I did not mention Hailey. I did not assign blame. I simply established facts. 2 days later, the fallout reached the condo. A message came through the building's online portal noting a termination of filming authorization. Then another arrived confirmation that the sponsorship partnership tied to the shipments had been withdrawn due to misrepresentation of authorized property usage. Hailey learned about it almost immediately. That evening, Mom called. Her voice carried that familiar sharpness, the tone she used when she believed disappointment had been delivered toward the wrong direction. She insisted that I had overreacted, that I had humiliated my sister, that I had jeopardized Hailey's professional image. She accused me of choosing pride over family. I listened without responding emotionally. I told her that I did not cancel anything. The brands made their own decision once they saw the truth. Mom ended the call abruptly. There was no conclusion to reach. I sat quietly afterward, not triumphant, not angry, only steady. Only I had not argued. I had not explained more than necessary. I had simply taken one step to reclaim what was mine. 48 hours later, the building gave a final notice. It was delivered by email and printed on formal letterhead with clear language and no space for negotiation. The notice stated that unauthorized commercial activity had violated multiple terms of residency and that continued occupancy by any non-registered party would result in penalties to my account. There was a date and time listed by which Hailey needed to remove all of her belongings. There was no request for discussion, no suggestion of reconsideration, only the expectation that compliance would follow. I read it twice, not because I questioned the message, but because it symbolized the point that had been reached. Something that once felt intangible now stood in writing. I printed the notice and placed it on the kitchen counter. When Hailey walked in that evening, she ignored it at first, choosing instead to complain about losing brand deals and being treated unfairly by companies that, according to her, had overreacted. I did not respond to those claims. I simply pointed to the paper. She went silent when she recognized the building management seal. For a moment, there was no performance, no defensiveness, only shock. Then it shifted swiftly into anger. She said I had betrayed her, that I had chosen strangers over family, that I should have protected her instead of allowing her to face consequences alone. I remained still. I said that I had not created the consequences. She had. The next morning, Mom arrived unannounced. She carried the same emotional force she always employed when she believed a situation could be reshaped through determination alone. She spoke about childhood memories, about the meaning of family, about the responsibility of older siblings. She insisted that Hailey had made mistakes, but that mistakes should be softened by love, not punished. Each sentence carried urgency, as if emotion could undo legal documents and recorded evidence. I listened to every word. When she finally paused, I told her that love does not require surrendering the right to personal boundaries. I told her that I would not retract my actions and that the building's decision would stand. Mom's expression hardened. The conversation ended there. Dad came later in the day. He did not argue. He did not defend anyone. He stood quietly in the entryway, hands in his pockets, eyes lowered. He asked if I was certain. I answered yes. He nodded once and did not attempt persuasion. That was the entire conversation. When he left, Hailey understood that no one would intervene on her behalf. She packed quickly, but every movement carried resentment rather than acceptance. She slammed drawers, threw items into bags without folding, and announced repeatedly that I would regret this moment. I did not react. I did not soothe, apologize, or explain. I waited until the elevator doors closed behind her before I allowed myself to exhale. Once she was gone, I contacted a locksmith. The process took less than an hour. The new lock clicked into place with clean finality. I stored the old key fobs in a drawer and reset every security code associated with the building entry and garage. I updated account permissions, emergency contacts, and authorized guest lists. Step by step, I restored the condo to a space of certainty. When the work was done, I stood in the center of the living room. The silence felt unfamiliar at first, not peaceful yet, but open. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vengeful. I felt present. I had chosen a boundary and held it even when confronted by pressure that once would have changed my direction. The distance that formed between myself and my family was real, but so was the space I reclaimed in my own home. I placed the final documents in the folder with the rest of my records. Then I turned off my phone. I did not block anyone. I simply chose not to answer. A month later, the apartment was quiet again. The silence no longer felt unfamiliar. Instead, it carried a sense of balance that had slowly returned as I reclaimed my routines. I woke each morning without anticipation of disruption. I prepared meals without stepping around misplaced equipment. I came home from work to an environment that reflected my own choices. The absence of conflict created space for reflection, and I realized how much energy I had spent trying to prevent chaos rather than living in peace. My time was spent working, reading, walking by the river on weekends, and rediscovering the calm that comes from being alone without feeling lonely. During one of those afternoons, I met with a colleague of mine, Anthony, at a small cafe near the office. He greeted me with steady warmth and asked how I had been, but he did not ask about my family. The lack of that question was not careless or distant. It was respectful. It recognized that silence sometimes holds more honesty than forced conversation. We talked about work projects, upcoming travel schedules, and books we had recently enjoyed. The conversation flowed without weight, without the need to defend or explain anything. When we parted, I felt something subtle shift. The world had not collapsed. It had simply become quieter. There were no attempts at reconciliation. Mom mailed a holiday card, but the message inside was formal rather than personal. Dad sent a brief text asking about my well-being. I replied politely. Hailey remained silent. I did not reach out either. There was no anger left, only distance shaped by choices that could not be undone. Boundaries had been drawn not for punishment, but for survival. I understood now that stepping back was not the same as abandoning love. It was protecting the parts of myself that had been neglected while trying to carry everyone else. The lesson I learned during that time was simple but profound. Family can be meaningful, but meaning does not excuse harm. Love requires responsibility. It requires awareness of how our actions affect others. When those we care about refuse to acknowledge that impact, we must decide whether to remain in cycles that drain us. Choosing peace sometimes means choosing separation. Letting go can be the only way to prevent history from repeating. Independence is not coldness, it is clarity. Thank you for listening to my story. I know everyone comes from different families with different histories, and every situation carries its own weight. I am curious how you would have approached this path, whether you would have made the same choice or taken a different direction. If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts or experiences. I read every perspective with care, and I believe we learn most from the moments we speak honestly with one another.